The town was called Three Forks, but it was a generous name. It was little more than a single stripe of churned mud and alkali dust gouged into the Montana plain. The wind had no trees to stop it, and it blew constantly from the north, carrying the promise of an early and bitter winter. It was this wind that Illa McPherson rode against. Her head bent low, the brim of her father's hat pulled down to her eyebrows. She had been riding south for 5 days, and the exhaustion sat on her like a physical weight, heavier than the bedroll and rifle strapped behind her saddle. Her horse, a broad-backed gelding named Stone, was just as weary. He plodded, head hanging, his hooves making dull, sucking sounds in the wet dirt of the main street. Illa was a tall woman. That was the first thing anyone ever saw. She was 6'2" in her worn-out boots, and her shoulders were as broad as any man's. She was not fat, but she was heavy-boned and thick with the muscle built from a life of splitting wood, hauling water, and hunting in the high, cold hills of the north. Men stopped what they were doing to watch her ride in. They stopped leaning against the raw pine posts of the general store. They paused in the doorway of the smithy, hammers quiet in their hands. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were not. Illa was used to the stares. She had been getting them her whole life. They looked at her like she was a curiosity, something misplaced. A circus bear wandered into a church. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the swinging sign of the only saloon, the Teton Bull. She was 24 years old, and she had come south to be married. The deal had been struck by her father, Abel, 6 months before he died. He had been a hard man, silent and coughing for the last 2 years, his lungs slowly filling with fluid. He had owed a debt to a cattle baron named Silas Croft, a debt for 200 acres of land that Abel had claimed but never been able to prove. Land Croft said was his. The debt was old, but Croft had not forgotten it. "He'll take the land back when I'm gone," Abel had rasped, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of their small cabin. "He'll run you off it, but he offered a trade." Illa had said nothing, just kept stirring the thin rabbit stew. "He has a son," Abel said, "unmarried. He wants him settled. He said he'd wipe the debt for a bride." Illa's hand had stopped moving. She had looked at her father, at his gray, sunken face. He had not been able to meet her eyes. "You'll go south to Three Forks," he'd said, turning his head to cough. "When I'm gone, you'll go to Croft. He'll see you married. The land will be yours then, free and clear." He had made her promise. And so, 2 weeks after she had buried him on the ridge, she had packed her father's rifle, a side of smoked venison, and her mother's wedding band, a thin, worn loop of silver she had never seen the woman wear, and she had ridden south. She swung her leg over the saddle, her boot hitting the mud with a solid thud. The horse gave a low groan of relief. She tied the reins to the hitching post outside the Teton Bull, her movements slow and stiff. She could feel the stares on her back, a dozen pinpricks of curiosity and judgment. She pulled her coat tight. It was a man's coat, made of heavy wool, and it was still too short in the arms. She pushed the saloon doors open. The noise inside stopped. It did not fade. It was cut, as if with a knife. The sour smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and wet wool hit her. The room was dark, crowded with men. A long bar ran down one side. A pot-bellied stove glowed dull red in the center. Every man in the room was looking at her. Illa's eyes scanned the faces, looking for a man who looked like he owned things. She saw him in the back, at a table, sitting with 2 other men. He was older, with a thick gray beard and hands like slabs of meat resting on the table. This must be Silas Croft. She walked toward him. The floorboards bowed slightly under her weight. She had to duck to pass under a low-hanging oil lamp. She stopped at his table. "Mr. Croft?" she asked. Her voice was low and rough, cracked from the wind. Silas Croft looked up at her. He took in her height, the breadth of her shoulders, the plain, strong face beneath the shadow of her hat. He did not get up. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Who's asking?" he said. "Illa McPherson. I'm Abel McPherson's daughter." A flicker of understanding, and then something else, passed over Croft's face. He glanced at the man sitting next to him, a younger man, skinny and wearing a fine vest that looked out of place. The younger man was already staring at Illa, his mouth half open in a smirk. "Well, I'll be," Silas Croft said, leaning back in his chair. "You made it. This here is my son, Flint." Illa turned her gaze to the sun. This was the man she was meant to marry. He was pale, with thin, slicked-down hair and a mean-looking mouth. Flint Croft let his eyes travel up her body, from her muddy boots to her coat, to her face. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "This is her?" he said, looking at his father. "This is what you traded 200 acres for? Pa, she's a giant." The men at the bar, who had been listening in the thick silence, let out a few nervous chuckles. "She's tall," Silas allowed, looking at Illa as if she were a horse he was considering buying. "But she looks strong stock. She'll birth strong sons. She'll birth colts, maybe," Flint sneered. And this time the laughter was louder, meaner. "God almighty, Pa, I ain't marrying an ox. Look at the size of her." "What am I supposed to do with that?" Illa stood frozen. The heat rose in her neck, a deep, burning shame that felt like poison. She kept her face blank, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had expected it to be cold, a business deal. She had not expected this public stripping down. "Now, son, a deal's a deal," Silas said, his voice lowering. "Not this one," Flint said, pushing his chair back and standing up. He was still a good 4 inches shorter than Illa. He had to look up at her to deliver his contempt. "I ain't hitching myself to a she-bear just so you can settle an old score. The debt stands. Tell her to go on. Get back to whatever mountain she climbed down." He looked around the room, grinning, playing to his audience. "Or maybe one of you boys wants her. Any of you looking for a wife who can split your firewood and be the firewood?" The saloon erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, braying sound that washed over Illa, pinning her in place. She looked at Silas Croft. His face was hard. He had lost control of his son, and he was angry, but not at Flint. He was angry at her for being what she was, for making him look foolish. "The deal's off," Silas said, his voice flat. He turned his attention back to his drink. He had dismissed her. For another 10 seconds. Illa did not move. She just absorbed the humiliation. The sound of the men's laughter, the heat of the stove, the smell of the whiskey. She felt the tears, hot and sharp, pushing at the back of her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not here. She turned, slowly, with a dignity that came from a lifetime of being looked at. She walked back through the room, the men moving their chairs slightly, as if to let something dangerous pass. She pushed open the saloon doors and stepped back out into the wind. The wind was a relief. It was cold and clean, and it stung her face. She walked to her horse, her movements wooden. She untied the reins, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She put her boot in the stirrup and hauled herself into the saddle. She did not look back at the saloon, at the yellow light and the sound of men. She nudged Stone with her heels, and the horse, sensing her urgency, moved into a tired trot. She rode out of Three Forks the same way she had come in, a solitary, oversized figure against the vast, gray sky. She rode for an hour, pushing the horse, until the town was just a smudge behind her. She rode until the plains gave way to low, rolling hills and the first stands of pine. Only then, when she was sure no one could see, did she let the tears come. They were not quiet, weeping tears. They were a hot, silent flood of rage. She did not sob. She just let them run down her face, freezing on her cheeks, while her heart hardened into something small and cold. She was furious at Flint Croft for his easy cruelty, furious at Silas for seeing her as livestock, furious at her father for making a deal he had no right to make, for selling her to clear a debt that was nothing more than his own pride. She rode until dusk, until the horse was stumbling with fatigue and she could no longer feel her hands. She found a small creek, a line of thin willows breaking the wind. She made camp. She did not build a fire. She could not be bothered. She slid from the saddle, her legs aching, and pulled the blanket from her bedroll. She ate the last of her venison, which was dry and hard as wood, and chewed on a piece of stale bread. She lay down with her saddle for a pillow, wrapped in the blanket, her rifle beside her. The ground was already cold, the frost creeping into the wool. Stone grazed nearby, his breath pluming in the dark. She lay awake, staring up at a sky that was thick with clouds. No stars visible. She thought of her father. He had raised her alone, after her mother had died birthing her. He had taught her to hunt, to track, to skin a buck, to set a trap. He had taught her to be strong, because he knew no other way. But he had never shown her a moment of softness. He had looked at her size, her strength, and he had seen a problem. "You're built wrong, girl," he had told her once, after she had carried a small log, one he had struggled with, back to the cabin. She had been 14. "It ain't right. A woman's meant to be soft, small. You're too much. No man will ever want what he can't gentle. You'll never be wanted." He had not said it to be cruel. He had said it as a fact, as a warning, like telling her which berries were poison, or how to spot a blizzard coming. Tonight, the men in the saloon had proved him right. She felt the shame of it settle in her stomach. A cold, heavy stone. She was a thing to be mocked, a giant, an ox, unwanted. She finally drifted into a cold, fitful sleep, her dreams full of laughter and hard, staring eyes. She woke before dawn, stiff and frozen. Every bone in her body ached. She forced herself up, saddled Stone, and started riding again. She had no destination. South was the town. North was the empty cabin, the land that was not hers, the grave she had dug. She just rode west, toward the jagged line of the highlands that looked like broken teeth against the sky. The weather turned, the wind picked up, and by mid-morning, a wet, heavy snow began to fall. It was not a flurry, it was a dumping. The flakes were large and wet, melting on her coat, soaking her to the skin. The world disappeared into a curtain of white. She had no food. The hunger, which had been a dull ache, was now a sharp, twisting pain in her belly. She grew dizzy. The cold was a living thing, crawling under her clothes, seeking her bones. She bent low over the horse's neck, just holding on. Stone plodded forward, his strength failing. Illa's vision blurred. The white of the snow became a blinding, dizzying swirl. She must have fallen asleep, or passed out, still in the saddle. She was jolted awake when Stone stopped, his head drooping. She looked around, but there was nothing to see but the driving snow and the black trunks of pine trees. They were in a forest, high on a slope. She knew, with a sudden, dull certainty, that if she stayed on the horse, she would freeze. She would die here, unwanted, in the middle of nowhere. She slid from the saddle, her legs buckling. She landed on her knees in the snow, which was already a foot deep. The horse did not move. "Go on," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. She pushed herself up, using the stirrup for leverage. She had to find shelter. A rock, a thicket, anything. She stumbled forward, pushing through the snow, her body numb. The world was silent, save for the whisper of the falling snow and the hammering of her own heart. She tripped on a root and fell hard. She lay there for a moment, the snow cold on her face. It felt so easy to just close her eyes, to just stop. No, the same hardness that her father had cursed in her, the same strength that Flint Croft had mocked, was the only thing she had left. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. She crawled, and then she saw it. It was so small and hidden, she had almost missed it. Tucked into a fold in the hill, half buried by pines, was a cabin. It was tiny, barely more than a trapper's lean-to, but there was a thin, almost invisible line of smoke rising from a stone chimney. She felt a surge of hope so sharp it was painful. She got to her feet, staggering, and pushed her way through the last few yards of brush. She reached the door, a rough planked thing, and lifted her fist. She knocked, the sound deadened by the snow. She waited. A minute passed. She knocked again, harder, using the last of her strength. She heard a sound inside, a bar being lifted. The door creaked open 6 inches. A man's face peered out. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a face that was surprisingly soft. He had large, dark eyes and a mouth that looked like it had not spoken in a long time. He was not large. He was slight of build, and the sight of her seemed to terrify him. His eyes went wide, taking in her size, her wild, snow-matted hair, the ice on her coat. He looked like a deer cornered by a wolf. Illa's lips were cracked and numb. She forced the words out. "Shelter," she whispered. "Please." The man, Wesley, just stared. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked past her, at the wall of snow, then back at her face. He was trembling. She could see his hand on the edge of the door, shaking. The wind howled, blowing a gust of snow past her, into the tiny cabin. The man flinched at the cold. He looked at her one more time, his eyes full of a fear she did not understand. Then, without a word, he stepped back, pulling the door open just wide enough for her to enter. Illa stumbled over the threshold and into the warmth. Wesley immediately pushed the door shut behind her, slamming it against the storm. He fumbled with the wooden bar, dropping it back into place. He bolted himself in, with her. The cabin was one small room. It was suffocatingly small. Now that she was in it, she had to duck her head to keep from hitting the low log beams of the ceiling. A fire crackled in a stone hearth on the far wall, casting a low, orange light. The room held a single cot, a small, rough table, and a few shelves. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something animal, like old pelts. Her presence seemed to have shrunk the room to nothing. She stood in the center, dripping melted snow onto the packed earth floor, unable to move. Wesley did not look at her. He scrambled away, retreating to the far corner by the hearth. As far from her as he could get, he grabbed a poker and stabbed at the fire, making sparks fly, pretending to be busy. He was shaking. It was not just the cold. She could see his whole body trembling. He kept glancing at her, quick, terrified looks. But he was not looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, which were clenched at her sides, raw and red from the cold, the knuckles scarred. He looked at her jaw, set hard as she tried to control her own shivering. She was a giant in his tiny, hidden world. He moved to the hearth, where a small pot bubbled. He took a wooden bowl from a shelf, ladled a small amount of steaming liquid into it, and set it on the table. He did not look at her. He gestured to the bowl, then retreated back to the fire, his shoulders hunched. Illa moved to the table. There was one stool. She sat, and it creaked ominously under her weight. The bowl held a thin stew. She saw a few pieces of potato, maybe some squirrel meat. She picked up the spoon. Her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly hold it. She lifted the spoon to her lips. The stew was hot, and it burned her mouth, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was warmth. It was life. She ate, not caring how she looked. She ate with a desperate, starving focus, scraping the bowl clean. The man, Wesley, stood by the fire, watching her. He held a rifle in his hands, held loosely at his side, as if he was not sure whether he should be pointing it at her or not. He watched her eat every bite. She finished. She set the spoon down. The sound loud in the tiny, silent room. The warmth of the food was spreading through her, pushing back the deadly cold. She looked at him. He was still watching her, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was a low croak. He just stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he gave a single, jerky nod of his head. He said nothing. The silence settled back in, heavier than the snow outside. It was awkward and thick with fear, his fear, and her exhaustion. The night had come on, and the storm raged, trapping them there. The giant woman and the silent, trembling man, in a room that was not big enough for both of them. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the snow piled in drifts that buried the tiny cabin up to its windows, sealing them inside a small, dim, quiet world. Illa had slept on the floor, on her own bedroll, as close to the hearth as she could get. Wesley stayed on his cot on the opposite wall. The first morning, she woke to find him already dressed, nervously sharpening a skinning knife, pretending she was not there. The silence was thick, broken only by the wind and the crackle of the fire. She was not a guest, she was a burden, and she knew it. But she was also a survivor. On the second day, she pulled on her still damp boots and coat. Wesley watched her, his eyes wide with alarm, as she grabbed the heavy axe leaning by the door. "The wood's low," she said, her voice rough. He said nothing, just watched her lift the heavy bar from the door and step out into the blinding white. Illa waded through the chest-deep snow to the woodpile, a half-cord stacked against the leeward side of the cabin. She pulled a large, frozen log of pine free and set it on the block. She swung the axe. Wesley watched her through the single, wavy-paned window. He had never seen a woman move like that. She was not clumsy. She was powerful. Her shoulders, broad as they were, put all her weight into the swing. The axe bit deep, splitting the log in one clean strike. She moved with an economy of motion, wasting nothing. In 10 minutes, she had split more wood than he usually did in an hour. She loaded her arms with the fragrant, splintered pine and carried it back, pushing the door open with her shoulder. She dumped the wood by the hearth without a word, stamped the snow from her boots, and went back out. She did this 3 times. The cabin was now stocked with enough firewood for 2 more days. Wesley had not moved from the window. He felt a strange, humming mix of awe and inadequacy. On the 3rd day, the snow had stopped, but the cold was sharper. The weight of the snow on the small lean-to where he stored his traps had snapped a supporting beam. Illa saw it when she went out to fetch water. She came back in. "The roof on your shed is breaking." Wesley pulled on his coat and followed her. He saw the damage. The roof sagged, threatening to collapse. "It's finished," he said, his voice flat. "No, it ain't," Illa said. She studied it for a moment, her eyes scanning the structure. "We just need to brace it. Get that other beam, the one by the woodpile." He fetched it. It was heavy, and he struggled, dragging it through the snow. Illa took it from him, lifting it as if it were a fence rail. "Hold the roof," she told him. He pushed up against the sagging boards, his arms straining. He was not strong enough. The roof barely budged. "Wait," she said. She jammed one end of the new beam into the snowpack, angled it under the broken spot, and then put her shoulder to the wood. With a single, controlled grunt, she lifted. The roof groaned and rose 6 inches. "Now," she commanded. "Set the old one. Quick!" Wesley scrambled, his fingers numb, and managed to wedge the broken piece back into place to hold the new brace. Illa stepped back. The roof was secure. He stared at her, breathing hard, his face red from exertion. She was just breathing normally, wiping sawdust from her sleeve. She had done it. He had been useless. "Thanks," he mumbled, looking at the ground. She only nodded. They fell into a routine. The storm had broken, but the world was frozen. She was a hunter. She found the snares he had not been able to check, reset them, and came back with 2 rabbits. She took his fishing line and hook and went to the river, finding a spot where the ice was thin. She sat for an hour, patient as a stone, and came back with 3 fish. Wesley cooked. He was a good cook. In a simple way, he made stews and roasted the meat. He mended his traps and oiled his rifle. They worked around each other in the tiny cabin, 2 people living in a space meant for one. They rarely spoke. The cabin was so small that they could not help but brush against each other. Each time, he would recoil, flinching away, and she would pretend not to notice. She did not ask him why he lived alone. She did not ask about the haunted look in his eyes or why he spoke in whispers, if he spoke at all. She had lived with a silent, haunted man her whole life. This was familiar. The tension, however, was not. It was a new thing, a cord pulling tighter each day. It was the tension of a man and a woman, alone, trapped by a frozen world. One morning, nearly a week after her arrival, Illa went to check the river traps. A sudden thaw had made the ice near the bank unstable. She broke through. The water was not deep, only to her waist, but it was a shocking, paralyzing cold. She hauled herself out, gasping, her clothes instantly freezing to her body. She ran back to the cabin, stumbling, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She slammed the door open and collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. Wesley spun around. He saw her, soaked and blue, ice forming in her hair. The terror on his face was absolute. He had seen this before. He knew what the cold could do. Get them off, he stammered, his voice cracking. The clothes, now! He scrambled to his cot and grabbed his own dry things, a thick wool shirt, his spare set of long underwear. He thrust them at her, his hands shaking. Here! Illa's fingers were numb. She fumbled with the buttons of her coat, her hands useless. Wesley, seeing her struggle, knelt in front of her. He did not ask. He just started unbuttoning her coat, his movements jerky and panicked. He pulled the frozen, heavy wool from her shoulders. Her shirt beneath was soaked, clinging to her skin. She reached for the buttons, but her fingers were blocks of wood. I can't, she whispered. Wesley stared at her hands, then at her face. He took a sharp breath. He looked terrified, but he reached out and, his fingers brushing her cold skin, he undid the buttons of her shirt, one by one. He peeled the wet, cold fabric off her shoulders and arms, pulling it away. She wore a thin chemise beneath, and it was just as wet, plastered to her skin, outlining the heavy, full curves of her breasts and the strong muscles of her stomach. He froze. He just knelt there, his hands in the air, staring at her. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her body. His breathing had stopped. Illa, practical and half-frozen, had no time for shame. She grabbed the chemise and pulled it over her head in one swift motion. Tossing the wet bundle aside, she sat before him, bare to the waist. Her skin was red from the cold, her muscles defined. She was a big woman, and she was all woman. Wesley made a sound, a small, choked gasp. He tore his eyes away, his face flooding with a dark, painful red. He whipped his head around, staring at the fire, his whole body trembling as if he were the one who had fallen in the river. Illa stopped, the dry clothes in her lap. She watched him. He was hiding his face, but she could see the color in his neck, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped his knee. This was not the sneer of Flint Croft. This was not the dismissive judgment of his father. This was something else. This was panic. A slow realization dawned on her. Have you never seen a woman undressed? She asked. Her voice was gentle, a little rough from the cold. Wesley did not answer. He could not speak. He just gave a short, jerky shake of his head, still refusing to look at her. Illa pulled the dry shirt on. It was laughably small. The fabric strained across her shoulders, and the sleeves stopped halfway down her forearms, but it was warm. She pulled the long underwear on, her wet trousers adding to the puddle on the floor. She saw it clearly now. He was not disgusted by her size. He was afraid of her. Or perhaps he was afraid of what she made him feel. He was afraid of wanting. She had seen men look at her with contempt, with mockery, and with cold assessment. She had never, in her entire life, seen a man look at her with simple, terrified desire. That night, the silence at dinner was different. It was charged. Wesley could not look at her. He kept his eyes on his bowl of rabbit stew, his shoulders hunched. Illa watched him over the rim of her spoon. The small table was the only one he had. They sat opposite each other, their knees separated by a hand's breadth. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced on his face. He looked younger than his years, and deeply sad. She felt a sudden, powerful rush of gratitude. He had not laughed at her. He had not called her an ox. He had bolted his door against the storm, not against her. He had given her his clothes. He had seen her, and he was still here, trembling, but here. She reached her hand across the table. It was a simple gesture. Her hand was large, the knuckles calloused, the nails short and clean. She meant only to touch his hand, to say thank you, without words. Her fingers brushed the back of his. Wesley flinched. It was not a small movement. He recoiled as if she had struck him, pulling his hand back into his lap. He knocked his spoon to the floor, where it clattered loudly in the silence. His face drained of all color. He looked horrified, first at his hand, then at her. Illa froze, her own hand still hovering in the air. The warmth in her chest turned instantly to ice. It was the saloon all over again. The laughter, the pointing. Too much. Built wrong. Unwanted. The shame was so sudden, so total, that she felt sick. Wesley saw the light go out of her eyes. He saw the way her face hardened, the way her hands slowly retreated. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He stood up so quickly his stool scraped against the dirt floor. He grabbed his bowl, half full, and retreated to the shadows by the hearth, turning his back to her. Illa sat alone at the table, staring at the empty space where his hand had been. That night, she did not sleep. She lay in her bedroll, facing the fire, and willed herself not to cry. But sleep, when it finally came, was full of strange, formless dreams. She dreamed of a hand. It was not her father's hard, punishing hand. It was not Flintcroft's pale, mocking one. It was a gentle hand. In the dream, it touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw. It was not afraid of her. It touched her hair, not to pull, but to smooth. It rested on her shoulder, and the touch was warm. It was a dream of softness, a thing she had only ever seen from a distance. She woke in the deep, cold dark, hours before dawn. The fire was low embers. Wesley was a still shape on his cot, his breathing even. Illa was crying. She made no sound. The tears just ran, hot and silent, from the corners of her eyes, soaking her hair. The yearning was an ache in her chest, a hunger for something she had never been allowed to want. Wesley was already awake. He lay on his cot, rigid, facing the wall. He had been awake for hours. He had felt her touch all night, like a brand on his skin. When she had touched him, it was not just surprise. It was a jolt of pure, blinding panic. He had not felt a woman's touch since his mother died. And Illa's touch was not like his mother's. It was the touch of a woman. It had sparked something in him he thought was long dead, buried under years of shame. When he heard her crying, the small, hitching breaths she thought were silent, it was a knife in his gut. He had done that. He had hurt her. He could not bear it. He could not breathe in the same room with her grief. Before the first light touched the snow, he slipped out of his cot. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, grabbed his rifle, and quietly lifted the bar on the door. He slipped out, closing it behind him, leaving her alone in the dark. He walked. He did not have a horse. He walked for miles, checking his trap lines. The air was sharp, freezing his lungs, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head. He found a rabbit in one snare, its body frozen stiff. As he worked it free, his numb fingers fumbling with the wire, the memories came. They always came when he was alone and felt weak. He was 10 years old, hiding under the kitchen table. His father was drunk, his voice a roar. His mother was pleading. Wesley had watched his father's boots as he crossed the floor. He heard the sound of an open hand hitting flesh. He heard his mother fall. He had stayed hidden, clenching his eyes shut, his own hands pressed over his mouth to keep from making a sound. He had done nothing. He was 17. Raiders, or maybe just drunk cowhands from a passing drive, had come through their small settlement. They were loud, breaking things. His father was in town. It was just him, his mother, and his younger sister, Sarah. The men burst into their cabin. They grabbed Sarah. She was small, pretty, soft, everything Illa was not. Sarah had screamed his name. "Wesley, help me!" He had looked at the men, big, loud, drunk men, and he had run. He ran out the back door, into the barn, and buried himself in the hayloft. He had listened. He heard his sister scream again, a terrible, cut-off sound. When his father returned, he found Wesley still hiding, long after the men were gone. He found Sarah's body in the cabin. He found his wife, beaten and broken, huddled in the corner. His father had not yelled. He had simply looked at Wesley with a contempt so deep it had no bottom. Then he had beaten him, methodically, until Wesley could not stand. He had called him a coward, a weakling, not a man. Wesley had left the next day and never looked back. He had come here, to the high, lonely mountains, where no one could see him, where he would never be tested again, where he could not fail anyone else. Now, this woman was in his cabin, a woman who was stronger than he was, braver than he was, a woman who looked at him with, what, not pity, not disgust, something else. And when she touched him, he had flinched. He had flinched because he knew, with a certainty that burned his soul, that he was still that coward. He was not a man. He could not protect her. He could not even stand to be touched by her. He stayed out all day. The cold gnawed at him, but he ignored it. He stared into the frozen landscape, lost in his own disgrace. It was late afternoon, the light already beginning to fade. When he finally turned back, he was empty-handed, save for the one frozen rabbit. He was cold, and he was filled with a familiar dread. He pushed open the cabin door. The room was empty. "Illa?" he said, his voice hesitant. Silence. The fire was low, the cabin cold. Her bedroll was gone. Her rifle was gone from the corner. A sharp, cold panic seized him. It was a feeling he had not expected. The cabin, which had felt suffocatingly small, now felt horrifyingly empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was dead. She was gone. She had left because of him. He ran outside, his boots slipping. "Illa!" He looked wildly around, at the trees, at the snow. Where would she go? Back to the town? She would freeze. He ran toward the river, the path they had worn in the snow. He was terrified. What if she had fallen through the ice again, and this time no one was there? He burst through the trees and stopped. She was there. She was sitting on a fallen log near the riverbank, the same one she had fished from. Her bedroll was at her feet, neatly tied. Her father's rifle was laid across her lap. She was staring at the black, churning water where the ice had broken away. Her face, when she looked up at him, was a mask of old, cold grief. He stopped, breathing hard, relief and shame warring in his chest. I thought you were gone," he panted. "I was going to," she said. Her voice was flat, all the warmth gone from it. "Why?" he asked, though he knew the answer. She stood up. She was so tall. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just strength, but a deep, terrible vulnerability. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice shaking with a cold anger. "I don't belong anywhere. I should have kept writing. I should have just let the snow take me." "No," he whispered. "Yes," she insisted. She took a step toward him. "You flinched last night. I touched your hand, and you pulled away like I was poison, like I was a leper. It wasn't," he stammered, backing up a step. "It's always the same," she said, her voice breaking. The humiliation from the saloon, the lifetime of her father's warnings, the pain of his rejection, it all burst forth. "It's my size. It's my hands. I'm not soft. I'm not pretty." She gestured at her own body, a gesture of pure self-hatred. Men want soft, pretty things, things they can feel big around, things they can protect. They don't want this. They don't want a giant, an ox. The tears she had held back for a week were streaming down her face now, but her voice was hard. "My own father told me I was too much for any man. The men in town, they laughed. They laughed at me." She looked at him, her heart stripped bare. "You're no different. Wesley, you're just quieter about it. You're afraid to even look at me. You're disgusted by me." He stood there and took it. He let her words hit him. She was right. He was afraid. But she was wrong about why. He had to say it. He had to give her something. He could not live with this. He took a shaky breath. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but in the cold, still air, it was as clear as a gunshot. "You're not too much," he said. Illa stopped, her breath hitching. He was looking at the snow at his feet, unable to meet her eyes. You're not the problem. Illa. He forced himself to look up. He forced her to see the shame that lived in him. His eyes were as raw as hers. I am, he whispered. I just don't know how to be enough. His words hung in the cold, still air between them. I just don't know how to be enough. Illa stood by the river, the rifle heavy in her lap. She had come out here to be alone, to let the rage and shame finally consume her, to be proven right that she was unwanted. She had expected him to agree, or to be silent. She had not expected this quiet, broken confession that mirrored her own. She was too much. He was not enough. It was, she realized, two ways of saying the same thing. They were both built wrong for the world. The fury in her chest did not vanish, but it softened, making room for something else, a strange, sharp ache of recognition. She looked at him, really looked at him, standing there in the snow, looking small and lost, his face pale with the truth he had just spoken. He was the first man who had not met her strength with mockery or his own brute force. He had met it with his own deep and abiding fear. She let out a long, slow breath. The steam plumed in front of her face. You said, "You're not too much," she said, her voice low. That's the first time any person has ever said that to me. He said nothing, just watched her, his hands clenched at his sides. She looked down at her bedroll at her feet, then back at the tiny cabin, barely visible through the pines. It was a shelter. It was warm. And it was his. It's getting cold, she said, her voice flat again. All the emotion packed away. She bent and, with one hand, lifted her heavy bedroll. She did not sling the rifle. She just held it in her other hand, muzzle down. She started to walk, not toward any trail, but back toward the cabin. She passed him, so close her shoulder nearly brushed his. He tensed, but did not move. Are you planning to bar the door? She asked, not looking back. Or are you going to let me in? That stew smells done. She heard his footsteps, hesitant at first, then quickening, as he hurried through the snow to catch up. He got to the door first, pulling it open for her. He did not look at her as she ducked her head to enter, but she felt the warmth from the cabin, and the strange, fragile warmth of a truce. She did not leave. The cabin settled into a new rhythm. It was a rhythm of two. They were no longer a stranger and a hermit. They were two people trapped in a small room, waiting for the world to thaw. And they had told each other the truth. The cots remained where they were, on opposite walls, a clear and respected distance. But the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the heavy, fearful silence of the first days. It was a companionable quiet, filled with the small sounds of living, the scrape of his knife on wood, the hiss of water in the pot, the rustle of her mending a tear in her coat, the soft thump of a log settling on the fire. Wesley began to talk. A little, not much. His voice was rough from disuse. He would name things. That's a gray jay, he'd say, pointing out the window. They steal things. Or, the snow's crusting. That's good. The traps will hold. She would nod and answer just as simply. I've seen them. My PA called them camp robbers. Or, the wind's from the east. It'll be colder tomorrow. They worked. Work was the language they both understood. He showed her how to reset his traps, the ones with the tricky springs. She showed him how to build a snow shield for the woodpile so it wouldn't be buried again. The little touches, the ones that had been so fraught, began to happen. They were small, practical things, stripped of fear. He handed her a hot mug of chicory, and his fingers brushed hers. He froze for a second, a bird about to take flight, but she just took the mug, her large hand closing around it. Thanks, she said. He let his breath out. It was a start. When they passed in the narrow space between the table and the hearth, he no longer flattened himself against the wall. His arm would brush her side. The first time it happened, they both tensed, but neither pulled away. It was just a brush of wool against wool. It was just a fact. One night, the fire was burning low, the wind quiet. Wesley was carving. A new skill he seemed to be relearning. He was working on a small, intricate shape, his brow furrowed. Illa was cleaning her rifle, the pieces laid out on her bedroll. The smell of gun oil filled the cabin. "You're good with that," he said, nodding at the rifle. "I've had it since I was 12, she said. "My PA gave it to me, said I was big enough to hunt for us. So I should learn." She snapped the mechanism back together. The sound, a sharp, oily click. "Said I was a better shot than him. By the end," she stared into the fire, "he taught me to be strong. He said I'd have to be, that I'd have no one else to rely on." Wesley stopped carving. He looked at her, at the hard line of her jaw in the firelight. "I was 16, Illa said, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. "There was a trapper, name of Jonah. He came by our cabin when Pa was gone to sell some pelts. He was a big man, always drunk. He'd looked at me. Before, Pa always warned me to stay inside when he was around." She traced the grain on the rifle stock with one finger. "He came in. Said Pa owed him for a trap. I told him Pa wasn't there. He just smiled. He said he'd take me, as payment instead. Said a girl my size could handle it, that I was built for it." Wesley's hands had gone white, gripping the piece of wood. "He grabbed me," Illa said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "He was strong. He tore my shirt. I had been splitting kindling. The axe was right there. I hit him. He was surprised. He fell back, and I hit him again, and again, until he stopped moving." She looked up, not at Wesley, but at her own hands, resting on the rifle. "When my PA came home 2 days later, he found the body. He looked at the axe. He looked at me. I told him what happened. He just shook his head. He said, 'God, girl, you're a monster.' He said I had a man's violence in me, that I'd frighten every man away, and the ones I didn't frighten, I'd kill. He said I'd spoiled myself for any decent man, forever." She finally looked at Wesley. Her eyes were dry, but here, in the safety of this tiny, hidden room, her shame was a physical thing. "He was right, wasn't he? I'm not a right woman." Wesley sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the fire. He put his knife and the piece of wood down on his cot. He looked at her hands, the hands that had split his firewood, caught his fish, and defended her own life. "He was wrong," Wesley whispered. Illa's head snapped up. "He was wrong," Wesley said again, his voice a little stronger. "You weren't a monster. You were just surviving. You did what you had to do. He should have been proud. He should have protected you, so you never had to—" The words hit her, harder than the trapper's fist. No one had ever defended that moment. She had carried it as her great, ugly secret, the proof of her unnaturalness. "You don't know," she started. "Yes, I do," he said, and his voice was thick with a new, raw pain. "I know what it's like. To be in that moment, only I'm not a survivor. I'm the other thing." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands, and he told her about the raiders, about the cabin, and the shouting, and the noise of things breaking. "My sister," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "She was small, so small, and pretty. Everyone said so. They grabbed her. She screamed. She screamed my name. 'Wesley, help me!' He dropped his hands, his face pale and slick. "I was right there, in the barn, not 10 yards away. I had a pitchfork. I could have run in, made noise, fought, anything." He looked at Illa, his eyes wide with a 17-year-old's terror, still living in him. I hid. I climbed into the hayloft, and I buried my face, and I prayed. I prayed for them to go away. I hid. I heard her scream again, and then it was quiet. I ran. I'm a coward. Illa, a real one." He told her about his father finding him, hours later, still shaking in the hay, about the look in his father's eyes, the word coward, the beating, the disownment. "Your father called you a monster for fighting. Wesley said, a terrible, bitter smile twisting his mouth. Mine called me less than a man for running. Maybe they were both right. We're a pair, ain't we? The monster and the coward. Illa stared at him. She saw him, truly saw him. A young man, no older than she was now, broken by a single moment of paralyzing fear. A fear she had never known, because her body had always been a weapon. His had been a cage. A hot, sharp tear slid down her own cheek. It was not for herself. It was for him. She moved. She did not think about it. She slid off her bedroll, crawling the few feet of dirt floor that separated them. He flinched, tensing, as this giant of a woman loomed over him. He was afraid she would hit him, or recoil from him in disgust. She did neither. She sat on the floor in front of him, and she put her arms around him. It was awkward. She was so much larger. She wrapped her arms around his back, pulling him from his cot, and just held him. He was rigid at first, a block of wood, his hands trapped between their bodies. He was trembling, a deep, violent, full-body shudder. She held him, her chin resting on top of his head. She said nothing. She just held him, like he was a broken, frightened child. And then, for the first time since he was a boy, Wesley gave in. He didn't cry. He just broke. A terrible, ragged sigh tore out of him, and his body went limp. He sagged against her, his face buried in the rough wool of her shirt, and he held on to her. His hands gripped her sides, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. They stayed like that, fully clothed, by the dying fire. It was not about lust. It was not about man and woman. It was about two people, broken in opposite ways, who had just shown each other their deepest, darkest scars, and had not run away. They were holding the shame for each other. And for a little while, it felt lighter. After that, everything was different. The next morning, the air was clean. The thaw had firmed up. "We're almost out of meat," she said. It was a statement of fact. "I'll check the snares," he said. "Snares ain't enough," she said. "We need real meat." She picked up her rifle. "I'm going hunting." He felt the old panic rise. "It's not safe. The snow. There's wolves." "I can handle wolves," she said. And for the first time, it was not a boast. It was a simple truth. "Keep the fire hot. Wesley, I'll be back." She was gone all day. Wesley paced the cabin. He could not settle. He tried to carve, but his hands shook. He went outside, staring at the empty, white landscape, straining for the sound of a shot. This was a new fear. It was not for himself. It was for her. He realized he did not want the cabin to be empty again. Just as the sun was turning the snow a deep, bruised purple, he heard it, a single, heavy shot, echoing off the high ridges. An hour later, she appeared. She was not walking. She was hauling. She had a young buck, a good-sized one, slung over her shoulders. She was covered in sweat, despite the cold, and her face was grim with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright. She dropped the deer by the cabin door with a heavy, wet thud. "We'll eat tonight," she panted. He stared at the deer, then at her. He had never in his life. "I'll help," he said. He brought the lantern, and they set to work. It was a bloody, visceral, steaming task, but they did it together. He was not strong, but his hands were quick. He was good with a skinning knife. She was strong, and she did the heavy work, field dressing the carcass with an efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful. It was a partnership, her strength, his precision. She no longer felt the need to hide her power. She used it, for them. He no longer felt ashamed of his lack of it. He did what he could. Their hands met, slick and warm, inside the carcass as they worked to free the tenderloin. He did not pull away. He just paused, his fingers against hers. He looked up. She was watching him, her face smeared with blood, her hair loose. The lantern light was in her eyes. He held her gaze. It was a second, two. It was longer than he had ever held it. The air was thick with the smell of iron and pine. He saw something in her eyes he had seen before, when she had undressed by the fire. Not fear, not shame, Want, he swallowed, and his hand, still touching hers, trembled. He did not pull it away. That night, a storm rolled in. Not snow, a crack of lightning, a rare, violent thing for this time of year. The thunder was so loud it shook the dirt from the roof beams. Illa, who had faced a bear, who had killed a man, who had hauled a deer from a ravine, jumped, a small, terrified cry escaping her. Another crack of lightning, brighter this time, lit the cabin like daylight. Illa was huddled by the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands over her ears. She was shaking. Wesley stared. This woman of impossible strength was terrified. "Illa," he said, getting up from his cot. "The sound," she whispered, her voice tight. "My PA, when he was drunk and he got angry, he'd throw things, the table, the chairs. It sounded just like that, right before. She was ashamed of this. He could see it, her, the strong one, afraid of a sound. Wesley looked at her, huddled and small. Despite her size, he saw, in that moment, not the giant, not the monster. He just saw Illa. He did not go back to his cot. He went to the hearth, and he sat down beside her. He did not touch her. He just sat. He sat beside her, his shoulders nearly touching hers, and he stared into the fire with her. He was not running. He was staying. He was sitting with her in the dark, while the storm raged outside. She slowly lowered her hands. She looked at him. He was not big. He was not loud. He was not a fighter, but he was here. He had seen the absolute worst of her. Her violence, her shame, and now her fear, and he had not left. The thunder rolled again, softer this time. She looked at him, her eyes dark in the firelight. "You're a good man." "Wesley," she whispered. He shook his head, the old reflex. I'm a coward." "No," she said, her voice firm. She turned to him. "You're not. A coward would have let me freeze. A coward would have looked at my hands and called me a monster. A coward would be on his cot right now, hiding." She put her hand on his knee. He froze, but this time it was not a flinch. It was just a stop. "You stayed," she said. "You sat here with me." The space between them was electric, the storm outside and the storm inside. She looked at his mouth. "I'm starving, Wesley," she said, her voice dropping, becoming thick and rough. He looked confused. I can roast some of the venison." "No." She shook her head. Her hand on his knee was warm. He could feel the heat of it through his trousers. "I'm starving. For a man. For something. Something I've never had. Something I was told I couldn't have." Her eyes were locked on his. She was giving him every chance to run. Slowly. Deliberately. She unbuttoned the top button of the small wool shirt he had given her. Her eyes never left his face. He was paralyzed. He was terrified. He was drowning in a feeling he had no name for. It was pure, unadulterated want, and it scared him more than the raiders ever had. She undid the second button. The shirt parted, revealing the pale skin and the shadow between her breasts. "Illa," he whispered. It was a plea. "Please, I don't know how, I don't know what to do. I'll fail you. I'll be wrong." "You don't have to do anything," she whispered back, her voice urgent. She leaned in. She was so close now. He could smell the smoke in her hair. "You just have to not run. Can you do that? Can you just stay?" He couldn't speak. He just stared at her lips. So she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was soft. Yes, but it was urgent. It was the kiss of a starving woman. It was all the years of being unwanted, of being too much, focused into one simple, desperate act. She was not asking. She was choosing. He was frozen for a second, a man of ice. And then the kiss, her warmth, her softness, broke him. A small, trembling sound escaped his throat, and his hand, the one that had flinched, came up and gripped her arm. She pulled back, but only an inch, just enough to see his face. His eyes were closed, his face tight with a feeling that was half terror, half agony. She took his hand. She led him from the fire to his cot. She pushed him down gently, and he went pliant. She did not lie on her own bedroll. She lay down beside him, on the narrow cot that was barely big enough for one of them, let alone two. She pulled the blankets over them, creating a small, warm, dark world. They lay side by side, facing each other. He was still trembling. She took his hand and placed it on her waist, on the bare skin where her shirt had parted. He just left it there, his fingers splayed, feeling her warmth. "Wesley," she whispered. He opened his eyes. They did not make love, not in the way of the world. He did not take her. She did not demand. They just touched. He put his other hand, hesitantly, on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She, in turn, laid her large, calloused hand flat on his chest, feeling his heart hammer like a trapped bird. They learned the shape of each other in the dark, his small, shaking hand on her strong, warm side, her large, rough hand on his smooth, narrow chest. They kissed again, slowly this time, awkwardly, learning the taste of each other. It was not about performance. It was not about pleasure. It was about discovering, after a lifetime of shame, how not to be afraid of want. They fell asleep like that, tangled and trembling. Two broken halves finally, touching. The days, which had been short and cold, began to lengthen. The sun had a new strength, and the world, which had been locked in white, began to thaw. The snow receded from the cabin, leaving behind a soft, damp earth that smelled of pine and renewal. The river, no longer choked with ice, ran fast and loud, and inside the small cabin, the ice had broken, too. They woke that first morning after, crammed together on the narrow cot, a tangle of limbs. Wesley woke first, his nose buried in her hair. He was terrified. He was pressed against a woman, a warm woman, and he had not died of shame. He had not run. He lay perfectly still, his heart hammering, breathing in her scent, when Illa stirred, her arm tightening around his waist. He did not flinch. He just let her. He let her hold him. The shyness between them was painful, but it was a sweet pain. They could barely look at each other over breakfast. A new, bright awareness was in the room. Every accidental touch was a jolt. She handed him the skillet, and her fingers brushed his. He looked up, his face red. She looked away, her own cheeks warm. They began to kiss. The kisses were hesitant at first, small, questioning things, stolen by the woodpile or in the smoky dimness of the cabin, but soon they became more certain. She would be splitting wood, and he would come and stand beside her. She would stop, her breathing heavy, and just look at him. He would reach out, his hand small and chapped, and place it on her arm, on the muscle there, and he would lean in. She learned that his kiss, which she had assumed would be as shy as he was surprisingly firm. He kissed her like he was starving. Too, they found they could laugh. It was a strange, rusty sound for both of them. One day, Wesley was trying to mend a tear in his coat, his brow furrowed, his stitches large and clumsy. Illa watched him, a smile touching her mouth. "You sew like a blind bear." "Wesley?" He looked up, offended, then saw the light in her eyes. "Well, you eat like one," he retorted, his voice small. Illa's jaw dropped, and then she laughed. It was not her father's gruff chuckle. It was a real, deep, rich laugh that filled the cabin. Wesley stared, mesmerized by the sound. He had made her laugh. A slow smile spread across his own face. It was the first time he had smiled, truly smiled, in a decade. "I do eat like a bear," she admitted, still grinning. "But at least I'm not afraid of the needle." She took the coat from him. "Give it here, half man." He did, and he watched her. Her large, calloused hands, which he had once feared, were now impossibly gentle. Her stitches small and neat. Wesley's practicality, mixed with a lingering thread of his old shyness, returned. It felt wrong, somehow improper, for them to be this without a proper bed. For her, he spent 2 full days outside. Illa, curious, watched him. He was building something. He was squaring logs, notching them with a precision she had not known he possessed. He was building a bed, a real one. It was wide, and it was strong. He set it up on the other side of the cabin, where her bedroll had been. It was a solid, fine piece of work. "It's for you," he said that evening, gesturing to it. He could not look at her. My cot's too small. This one, it's bigger. It should hold you proper." Illa looked at the new bed. It was a good bed. It was, she realized, the first thing anyone had ever built just for her. She looked at Wesley, at his red face, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was offering her a choice. He was offering her distance. If she wanted it. "It's a fine bed, Wesley," she said, her voice soft. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was an awkward, questioning thing again. Wesley lay on his small cot, rigid. He heard Illa move. He heard her settle onto the new bed. The creak of the fresh-cut pine was loud in the room. He lay there, his eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling. He felt a sudden, sharp cold. It was wrong. The room was too big again. The distance was wrong. He must have dozed. He was woken, hours later, by a sound, a floorboard creaking. He tensed, his eyes snapping open. He saw her shadow, a giant shape against the dying embers of the fire. She was standing in the middle of the room. He held his breath. She crossed the space. She came to his cot. "Illa," he whispered. She said nothing. She just pulled the blankets back, and with a sigh that seemed to come from her boots, she got in. It was an impossible fit. He was crushed against the cold log wall. Her back was to him, her body solid and warm. She had to curl her long legs to fit. "Your cot is too small," she whispered into the dark. "I know," he whispered back, his voice thick. "And it's lumpy." "I know." A moment of silence. Then she reached back, grabbing his arm, and pulled it around her, settling it across her waist. "But that one," she said, her voice a low rumble against his chest, "is too far away." Wesley let out the breath he had been holding. He did not say anything. He just held her. He buried his face in her hair. And for the first time in his life, he felt big. He felt like a shelter. He felt like a man. The new bed, built with such care, became a place to stack dried pelts and store blankets. They began to share everything, not just the cot. They shared the last of the deer meat, portioning it out fairly. They shared the mending. They shared the water hauling. And they shared their stories. They unspooled their lives for each other in the dark, quiet hours, voices low, the fire crackling. They shared the small, ugly shames and the tiny, forgotten hopes. They were, in this small, hidden cabin, a world of two. One evening, they sat by the fire, side by side, her leg pressed against his. The air was comfortable, warm. Illa, who'd been quiet for a while, finally spoke. "I was supposed to be a bride, you know," she said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the hiss of the fire. Wesley turned to look at her. "A bride?" She nodded. She told him everything, about her father's debt, about the cattle baron, Silas Croft, and about the son, Flint. She told him about the saloon, about the whole room of men, about the laughter. He said I was an ox," she whispered, the shame of it still as fresh as a new wound. "He said, who'd marry a she-bear? He said no man would have me, that I was worthless. He refused me in front of everyone." She was looking into the fire, but her pain was for him. She realized, afraid of his judgment. He was right. "Wesley, I'm not a wife. I'm not the kind of woman a man marries. I'm not soft. I'm not pretty." Wesley looked at her. He looked at her strong profile, the line of her jaw, the way the firelight caught the wild strands of her hair. He looked at her hands, resting on her knee, hands that had fed them, defended her, and held him with a tenderness that still made his heart ache. He was not a man of words. He did not know how to say the things that were filling his chest. He fumbled for the truth. He was a fool, Wesley said, his voice rough. He was a weak man, so he had to break something to feel strong. That's all. But he was right, she insisted, her voice tight. No man would have me. He wasn't the right man. Illa, Wesley said. And the words, when they came, felt truer than anything he had ever said. That's all. He was just the wrong man. She turned her head, her eyes wide, searching his. The right man, she whispered. You think there's a right man for a giant, for a monster? He met her gaze. He was trembling, but he did not look away. I think, he said, his voice shaking, that maybe you just needed the right man. He took a shaky breath. I'm trying to be him, Illa. The confession hung in the air. It was more real, more binding than any vow spoken in a church. She looked at him, at this small, frightened, brave man who had seen all of her and had not run, who had been not enough, but had stayed. Oh, Wesley, she breathed. The last barrier, the last thread of doubt, broke. She leaned in, and she kissed him. This kiss was not the desperate, starving kiss of the storm. It was not the shy, quick kiss of the morning. This was a long, slow, deep kiss that spoke of everything they had not said. It was a kiss of knowing. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark, his breathing ragged. The air in the cabin was thick, charged. The want that had been a quiet stream beneath their days was now a river, overflowing its banks. Illa, he whispered. It was a question and a plea. She stood and pulled him to his feet. She led him to the cot, to their shared space. The room was dark, save for the firelight. She began to undress him. Her hands, for all their size, surprisingly gentle. He stood, paralyzed, letting her. She unbuttoned his shirt, her knuckles brushing his skin. He was trembling, a fine, full-body tremor. Illa, he said again, his voice cracking. I've never. I don't know how. I'll hurt you, or I'll be wrong. I'll fail. I'm not. She put her fingers to his lips, hushing him. She kissed his forehead. She pushed the shirt from his shoulders, and he let it fall. You can't be wrong. Wesley, she whispered, her voice thick. You can't fail. Just be here with me. Just see me. Don't be afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you, he breathed, his hands coming up, but hovering, afraid to touch her. I'm afraid of this, of me. She took his hands. She placed them on her waist. Then let me, she said. She undressed herself, her eyes never leaving his. She was not the practical, half-frozen woman by the fire. She was not ashamed. She was beautiful. She was large and strong and pale in the firelight, and she was, he realized, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She led him to the cot. The love they made was not the swift, brutal act she had always feared, or the graceful, easy thing she had read about in the one novel her mother had left. It was awkward. It was fumbling. It was real. He was terrified, his hands shaking so badly he could barely touch her. She was the strong one. She held him. She guided him. She showed him that her body was not a weapon. It was a home. She held his face between her hands, and she kissed him, slowly, until his trembling eased. He, in turn, discovered he was not a coward. He was gentle. His touch, when it finally firmed, was a question. His hands, which he had always seen as weak, learned the shape of her, the curve of her hip, the strength of her back. He was small, and she was large, but in the dark, on the narrow cot, they fit. It was a revelation. It was a quiet, desperate, beautiful thing. Afterward, they lay tangled, slick with sweat. The blankets kicked to the floor. The cabin was silent, but for their breathing. Wesley was completely still, his face buried in her shoulder. Illa, her heart full to bursting, held him, stroking his damp hair. She had never felt so seen, and then she felt it. A small, hitched breath, a tremor. His shoulders were shaking. He was weeping. It was not a loud, ragged sob. It was a silent, agonizing grief. Her heart seized. "Wesley?" she whispered, propping herself up on one elbow, her hair falling around her face. Did I hurt you? Was I too much?" He shook his head, unable to speak, his face still hidden. "Wesley, talk to me, please." He finally turned his head, his face a mess of tears, his eyes squeezed shut. "No," he choked out. "No, you weren't. It was, I—" He couldn't say it. He didn't have the words. He wasn't weeping from pain or from fear. He was weeping from the sheer, crushing relief. He was weeping because he had been with this woman, this magnificent, powerful woman. And he had not run. He had not failed. He had been terrified. And he had stayed. He had been a man, with her, and the world had not ended. The shame that had lived in him for a decade, it was gone. He had been enough. Illa looked at him, at his broken, beautiful face, and she understood. She understood everything. She didn't speak. She just leaned down. She kissed his chest, right over his hammering heart, tasting the salt of his tears. She kissed the old, faded scars on his ribs, the ones his father had given him. She kissed the trembling in his hands. She kissed his shame, and she kissed it away. They lived in that peace for a week. It was a stolen time, a pocket of the world that belonged only to them. The snow melted entirely from the clearing. Small, green shoots began to poke through the mulch of the forest floor. They worked, they ate, they slept. They were, in the way of people who have nothing, and then find everything. Completely and quietly happy. The peace was broken on a Tuesday. The sky was a high, clear blue. Illa was outside, in the bright sunlight, splitting the last of the deer bones with her axe. Wesley was inside, cleaning his rifle, whistling a tuneless, happy song. Illa heard it first. Her head snapped up. Hoofbeats. They were not the plodding walk of a single trapper. They were fast, and they were many. They were coming up the ridge. "Wesley!" she called, her voice sharp. She gripped the handle of the axe. He was at the door in a second, his rifle in his hand. He looked past her, his face pale. 3 riders burst into the clearing. They were not trappers. They were hard-faced men wearing dusty chaps and the unmistakable air of a cattle ranch. And in the lead, sitting on a fine black horse, was Flint Croft. He pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes taking in the scene, the tiny, poor cabin. Wesley, small and trembling in the doorway. Holding a rifle he looked too weak to use, and Illa. She was not the humiliated woman he remembered from the saloon. She was standing tall, the axe held loosely in one hand. Her hair was wild, her feet were bare, and she was looking at him not with fear, but with pure, cold hatred. Flint's surprise turned into a sneer. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice carrying in the clear air. "Found the she-bear in her den, and look, she's even got a cub." He nodded at Wesley. "What do you want, Croft?" Illa's voice was a low growl. "What do I want?" Flint laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My father's property, that's what. A deal's a deal. You ran off, girl, that's theft, and my PA, he don't like being made a fool of. He says you owe him." "The deal was off," Illa said, her knuckles white on the axe handle. "You refused it." "I refused it, yeah, but PA changed his mind. He don't like unfinished business. He says you're coming back. And what's this?" He looked at Wesley with pure, liquid contempt. "You think you can just keep her here? This little runt? You stealing her, boy?" The 2 other men dismounted, flanking him. They were big men, with guns on their hips. "She's not property," Wesley said. His voice was thin, and it was shaking. But it was clear. Flint turned to him, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "What'd you say, half-man?" "I said," Wesley repeated, taking a step out of the doorway. "She's not property. She's a free woman. You have no claim on her." The sneer on Flint's face vanished. "No claim? You're telling me. You're claiming her. This little rabbit? You think you're man enough to keep her?" Flint nodded to his men. "Get her." The two men moved toward Illa. She raised the axe. "Don't," she warned. One of the men just laughed and kept coming, but Wesley moved first. He did not run. He did not hide. He launched himself out of the doorway. Not at the two men, but at Flint, who was still on his horse. It was a wild, desperate, suicidal move. He grabbed Flint's leg, yanking with all his meager strength. "Leave her alone," Flint cursed, taken by surprise. He kicked out, his boot catching Wesley square in the chest. Wesley fell, skidding in the dirt. The air punched from his lungs. "Wesley!" Illa roared. She swung the axe, a whistling, deadly arc. The man was ready. He ducked, and the other one, coming from behind, grabbed her, his arms locking around her chest, pinning her own arms to her sides. The axe thudded to the ground. She fought. She bucked and kicked and roared like the she-bear he'd called her. But the man was huge, and he held on. "Wesley!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Wesley was already on his feet. He charged again. Flint, who had dismounted, met him. Flint was a town man, but he was a head taller than Wesley and 30 pounds heavier. He swung. A wild punch that Wesley ducked. Wesley hit him in the stomach. It was a weak blow, but it surprised Flint. "You little—" Flint snarled, and he hit Wesley. A solid, cracking fist to the jaw. Wesley's head snapped back, and he went down. "Hold him," Flint panted. The second man, seeing Illa was secured, ran over and grabbed Wesley, hauling him to his knees, twisting his arms behind his back. "So," Flint said, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You're a fighter now? Are you Runt?" He walked over to the helpless Wesley and kicked him, hard, in the ribs. Wesley collapsed, curling in on himself, gagging. "Stop it!" Illa shrieked, fighting the man who held her. Tears of rage and terror streaming down her face. "Leave him alone! Let him go!" Flint looked at her, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and he smiled. He walked over to Wesley, and he hit him again. A measured, brutal punch to the side of the head. Wesley went limp. "Wesley! Oh God, no! Wesley!" Illa was frantic, her strength useless. The man holding her was now tying her wrists with a rope. "You see," Flint said, his voice cold, looking at Illa, "he ain't man enough. He never was. Just a coward, hiding in the woods." He turned to his man. "Get her on a horse. She's coming back where she belongs." "No!" Illa screamed. "No! Wesley! Please! No!" They dragged her, kicking and screaming, to the spare horse. They lifted her, heavy as she was, and dumped her into the saddle, tying her bound hands to the saddle horn. Flint mounted his own horse. He gave one last look at the tiny, pathetic cabin, and at Wesley, a still, bloody heap in the dirt. He spat. "Let him rot." They rode out of the clearing, dragging Illa's horse behind them. Her screams echoed off the trees. His name, over and over. A raw, broken sound. "Wesley! Wesley! Wesley!" Then they were gone. The clearing was silent. The sun was still shining. A gray jay landed on the woodpile, tilted its head, and flew away. Night began to fall. The clearing grew dark, and the air grew cold. Inside the cabin, on the packed dirt floor, a man groaned. Wesley's world was a universe of pain. His jaw was fire. His ribs were broken. His head felt like it had been split open. He must have crawled back inside. He didn't remember. He lay in the dark, in the cold, empty room. The fire was dead. She was gone. The words were a void, a black hole that sucked all the air from his lungs. They took her, and he had failed. He had fought, but he had lost. His father was right. Flint was right. He was a coward. He was weak. He had run from the raiders, and he had fought Flint, and the end was the same. He had lost her. He had lost Sarah. He had lost his mother. He failed. He failed everyone he had ever. He lay there, letting the cold and the pain wash over him. It would be so easy to die. Just stop breathing. Just let go. Then, in the roaring darkness of his own head, he heard her. He heard her screaming his name. Wesley! She had been screaming for him. Not for help. For him. He remembered her voice. In the dark. Her hand on his chest. You're not too much. He remembered her, crammed into his cot. This one's too far away. He remembered her face, her eyes, when he'd said he was trying to be the right man. He had fought for her, and he had lost. But he had fought. He had not run. He had not hidden. He had stood up. She had lit a fire in him, the one he thought his father had beaten out of him, the one he thought the raiders had snuffed out. It was a tiny ember, buried deep under the pain, under 2 decades of shame. But it was there, and her name was the breath that fanned it. He lay on the cold dirt floor. He thought of her strength. He thought of her, bound, being dragged away by those men. He had to rise. He put a hand on the floor. His whole body screamed. He ignored it. He pushed himself to his knees. The cabin spun, a swirling vortex of blackness. He gagged, and the hot taste of blood filled his mouth. He crawled to the wall, his broken ribs grinding. He used the table, the one they had shared, to pull himself, hand over hand, to his feet. He stood, swaying, in the dark, empty cabin. He was a ruin of a man, battered, bloody, broken, but he was standing. He looked at the open doorway, a pale rectangle of dying light. He looked out into the night, toward the south, toward 3 Forks. He was shaking. He was quiet, but he was no longer a coward. He was determined. He was going to get her back. The jailhouse in 3 Forks was a small, mean box made of green pine. It had 2 rooms, the sheriff's front office, and a single cell in the back. This cell was where Illa found herself. It was 6 paces long and 4 paces wide. Her head was a hand's breadth from the ceiling. A single, narrow, barred window was set high in the back wall, too high to see anything but a sliver of gray, indifferent sky. She was not bound. Sheriff Brody, a heavy man with a stained vest and a permanent scowl, had unlocked her ropes, tossed her inside, and slammed the heavy door. Silas Croft will deal with you in the morning, he'd said, and left her. She had been there for a full day. She did not sit. She did not weep. She stood, or she paced, her long legs carrying her from one wall to the other in 3 strides. She was a panther in a dog crate. Her vast physical strength, the thing that had defined her, was useless here. The walls were thick, the bars were iron. She had hit them, once, when she was first thrown in. She had gripped the bars and pulled, a deep, animal roar in her chest. The iron had not budged. The sound had only brought laughter from the sheriff's office. She was a spectacle. The children of the town, brave in the sunlight, crept up to the small window to peer in at the giant woman. She would turn her head, her eyes flat and cold, and they would scatter, screaming with delicious terror. The women of the town were different. A few, the more respectable ones, walked past quickly, their faces averted, as if her shame were a disease. Others, poorer women, would pause, their expressions a mix of pity and fear. One, the wife of the blacksmith, had brought her a plate of cold beans and cornbread. Illa had stared at the food, then at the woman. "The man they left," Illa said, her voice a low rasp. "The small one. Wesley, did they—" The woman had flinched, afraid to answer. I don't know, miss, they say Flint Croft beat him bad. No one's seen him." Illa's heart, which had been a cold stone of rage, seemed to crack. No one's seen him. It was the ambiguity that was the worst torture. She had not turned back to the food, so she waited. Her refusal to cry was not a sign of courage. It was a sign of a rage so pure and white-hot it left no room for any other feeling. She was terrified for Wesley. The image of him, falling, his face bloody, the sound of Flint's boot hitting his ribs. It played over and over in her mind. And she, who could lift a deer, had been held by one man, her strength useless. She had screamed his name, and they had taken her. The townsfolk, she knew, were talking. She could hear the murmur from the street, from the saloon. They called her unnatural, an ox, a she-bear. They pitied her. They feared her. Not one of them, she knew, saw her as a woman. She was a problem. She was Silas Croft's runaway property. She was accused of theft, the theft of herself. She was standing, her forehead pressed against the cold logs of the wall. When she heard the horses, it was late afternoon on the second day. She had learned the rhythms of the town. This was not a rancher coming in. It was a single horse, moving with a slow, agonizing limp. She heard the horse stop outside. She heard the creak of leather as a man dismounted. A sound followed by a low, sharp groan of pain. She moved to the cell door, pressing her ear to the wood. She could hear the front office clearly. The front door of the sheriff's office opened. A man's boots, dragging, unsteady, scraped on the floorboards. "Sheriff," a voice said. Illa stopped breathing. It was not a voice. Really, it was a broken, dry croak, a word forced through a ruined throat. But it was his. It was Wesley. He was alive. Sheriff Brody let out a low, humorless laugh. "Well, look what the damn cat dragged back in. I thought Flint had finished you. You come back for another beaten boy?" There was a long pause, the sound of labored, wheezing breath. "Where is she?" Wesley said. "Where do you think? She's in the cell, where she belongs. Property of Silas Croft, awaiting collection." I want her released," Wesley said. This was met with a louder laugh. "You want her? Son, you're in no position to want anything except a grave. You're a fool. You're trespassing. You're consorting with a runaway, and you're interfering with Croft business. Now, you get out of my office before I arrest you, too." "She's not property," Wesley said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the room. "What did you say?" Brody's voice was suddenly cold. "She is not property. The deal was refused. She stole nothing." Illa's hands clenched into fists at her side. "No, Wesley, no, stop, run, please, run." "She didn't run." Wesley's voice was a little stronger now, raw with a feeling Illa had never heard from him. "She chose to live." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Illa could hear the buzzing of a fly in the front room. Then the scrape of Brody's chair. "That's it. You're done. Get out of my town, you little runt. You're nothing but a coward, hiding in the woods. You think you're a man now?" "I am a man," Wesley breathed, and it sounded like it cost him everything. "And I'm not leaving, not without her." "Then I'll make you leave," Brody roared. There was a sound, a heavy thud, a man's grunt. The office door burst open, and a body flew out, tumbling onto the dusty porch. Illa screamed. She scrambled for the high, narrow window, her fingers finding holds in the rough-hewn logs. She pulled herself up, her muscles straining, until her eyes were level with the bars. She had a clear view of the street, of the porch of the sheriff's office. Wesley was on his hands and knees, spitting blood into the dust. His face, it was not a face. It was a swollen, purple, unrecognizable mask. One eye was completely closed, his shirt was torn, and she could see the dark, ugly bruises on his side. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway, rolling his sleeves. He was a big man, heavy with gut, but powerful. "Had enough, boy?" Brody sneered. Wesley pushed himself, his arms shaking, up from the dust. He got one foot under him. He stood up. He was swaying, his hands held loosely at his sides. He was a ruin, but he was standing. He did not run. He looked at Brody, his one good eye streaming. He said nothing. He just stood there. "You stubborn little," Brody growled. He lunged, his fist swinging. It was not a fight. It was a beating. Brody hit him, a heavy, meaty blow to the stomach. Wesley doubled over, gasping, but he did not fall. He just took it. "Wesley!" Illa screamed, her voice a raw shriek, She was rattling the bars, pulling with all her strength, the iron biting into her palms. "Stop it! Leave him alone! Leave him alone!" Brody, hearing her, grinned. He turned back to Wesley. "She's watching. Runt! Put on a good show!" He hit him again. An open-handed slap that sounded like a gunshot. Wesley's head snapped back. He staggered, but his feet stayed planted. He was not running. Illa's vision blurred. The tears, the ones she had refused, were here. They were not tears of sadness. They were a hot, terrible, blinding rage. He was doing this for her. He was taking this for her. Her father had sold her. Flint had mocked her. But this man, this small, broken, terrified man, he was not running. For the first time in her entire life, someone was fighting for her. Not to own her, not to use her, but for her right to be. "I won't let you," Wesley gasped, blood pouring from his mouth. "You won't let me what?" Brody mocked. He drew back his fist for a final, heavy blow. But Wesley, in a last, desperate, surprising move, didn't try to block. He lunged forward, inside the swing, and he wrapped his arms around Brody's thick waist. He clung to him, a desperate, drowning man clinging to a log. For a moment, they were locked, Brody cursing, Wesley just holding on. It was the only defiance he had left. A deputy, hearing the commotion, ran out of the saloon. He saw the scene, and without a word, he grabbed Wesley from behind, pulling him off the sheriff. They threw him to the ground. Brody, his face purple with rage at being touched, kicked him hard, in the broken ribs. Illa heard the snap. She heard Wesley's breath go out of him in a terrible, wet sound. And he did not move. "That's enough, Sheriff," the deputy said, his voice nervous. "Croft won't want a corpse on his hands. Just enough." Brody, breathing hard, spat in the dust next to Wesley's head. "Get this trash out of here. Throw him in the alley with the pigs. He'll crawl away. Or he'll die. I don't care which." The deputy grabbed Wesley by the arm and dragged him, limp as a sack of grain, across the street and disappeared into the narrow alley between the general store and the smithy. Illa sagged, her strength gone, her hands sliding down the rough logs. She dropped to the cell floor, her knees hitting the hard dirt. She had seen it all. She had seen him not run. She had seen him stay. She did not weep. She was past it. The rage was gone, burned away, leaving something else, a core of ice, a resolve so cold and hard it was the only thing holding her up. She would get out. She would find him. And then she would come back for Brody, and for Flint, and for Silas Croft, and she would unmake their world. She sat in the dark. Hours passed. The town grew quiet. The moon rose, casting a pale, thin rectangle of light onto the floor from the high window. She heard the saloon close, the last drunk stumbling home. She heard the sheriff in the front office, his boots thudding on the desk, a low, wet snore beginning. She was sitting, her back to the wall, her eyes open. When she heard the sound, it was not the heavy bolt of the sheriff. It was a tiny, metallic scraping at the cell door lock. She stood up, silent as a shadow. The lock clicked. The heavy door creaked open. Just an inch, a woman's voice, a dry whisper. "Girl, are you in there?" Illa moved to the door. A woman stood in the darkness, a heavy shawl over her head, her face a mass of wrinkles in the gloom. She was older, thin and tough as whipcord. "Who are you?" Illa whispered. "No time for names," the woman said. Her voice hurried. "Get your things. Wait, you have no things. Just come, and be quiet as death. Brody's asleep in the chair. He's a heavy sleeper, but don't test it." Illa stepped out of the cell, ducking her head under the low frame. "Why?" The woman was already moving, tiptoeing toward the front door. "Silas Croft?" she whispered, her voice full of an old, cold venom. "He had a son, my boy, Samuel. Worked him on a winter cattle drive. Drove him till his lungs froze and his heart gave out. Left him on the prairie for the wolves. Silas, he takes, and he takes. I'm just taking one back." She paused at the front door, her hand on the latch. She looked Illa up and down, from her muddy boots to her wild hair, her great strong frame. "Some women," the widow whispered, a small, fierce smile touching her lips, "weren't born to be owned." She eased the door open. The street was empty, washed in pale moonlight. The air was cold. They slipped out, the widow pulling the door shut behind them. "I have horses," the widow, Martha, said. "Behind the smithy. Your big gelding was in the livery. Stone, they called him. Took some doing to get him." But Illa was not moving. She was staring at the dark, narrow slit of the alley across the street. "The man," Illa said, her voice thick. "Wesley. They threw him in the alley." Martha's face tightened. "Girl, he's probably dead. Or as good as. You need to ride. Now. They'll find you gone by dawn." "I am not leaving him," Illa said. It was not a plea. It was a fact. Martha stared at her for a long second, at the set of her jaw. She sighed. "Lord help you. Go. Go on. The horses are saddled. The big one. And my Sam's old mare. I'll see if I can make a sound. Draw Brody. If he wakes." "Thank you," Illa said. She did not wait. She ran. Her long legs covered the street in 5 strides. She plunged into the darkness of the alley. It smelled of sour whiskey, refuse, and pigs. "Wesley," she whispered, her voice frantic. She found him. He was a heap of rags, half buried in a pile of wet straw and filth. He was so still. "No," she breathed. She fell to her knees, her hands fumbling. "No, Wesley, no." She touched his face. It was cold, but beneath her fingers, a small, faint puff of breath. He was alive. "Wesley," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me. It's Illa. I'm here. We're getting out." She put her hands under his arms. He groaned, a deep, terrible sound from the bottom of his pain. "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now, hot and fast. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm here. I've got you." He was a dead weight. He could not help her. He was broken. Illa set her jaw. She was not a monster. She was not an ox. She was a woman, and she was strong. She looped her arms under his, around his ruined chest. She braced her feet in the mud, and she lifted. She lifted him, her muscles burning, her heart screaming. She got him to his feet, his body sagging against hers, his head lolling on her shoulder. She half dragged, half carried him out of the alley. He was heavier than the deer, or maybe she was just weaker. They stumbled into the moonlight. She got him to the horses tied in the shadow of the smithy. Her horse, Stone, whinnied, a low, anxious sound. "Easy, boy," she murmured. She looked at Wesley. She looked at the saddle. It was impossible. "Wesley," she said, her voice sharp, trying to cut through his fog. "You have to help me. Just 1 foot. You have to try." He groaned, his eyes fluttering. He seemed to understand. He tried to lift his leg. It was a pathetic, small movement. It was enough. Using her shoulder as a fulcrum and her arms as levers, she shoved and heaved and somehow bundled him into the saddle of the mare. He slumped forward, his face in the horse's mane, but he was on. She ripped a piece of her own shirt, tying his hands loosely to the saddle horn so he would not fall. She ran to Stone and swung herself up. She grabbed the reins of the mare. A light flickered on in the sheriff's office. A moment later, a shout. "She's gone! The cell's empty!" Illa did not hesitate. She dug her heels into Stone's sides, pulling the mare along. They walked, quiet as they could, to the edge of town. Another shout. "They're riding out! North! Go!" Illa roared, and she kicked Stone into a hard, pounding gallop. They exploded out of the town, Stone's massive hooves devouring the road, the mare stumbling, then catching the rhythm. Wesley a broken shape, bouncing dangerously in the saddle. They rode into the dark, cold night, the shouts of the town, the sounds of men and horses, already rising behind them. They were hunted, they were free, they rode north. There was no other direction. South was the town, the law, and Silas Croft. West and east were open plains, offering no cover. North was the high, hard country, the snow-blasted ridges and the broken land that Illa knew like the scars on her own hands. It was a country that did not forgive weakness, and they were two broken, bleeding things. Illa led, pulling the mare, her eyes fixed on the pale, frozen stars. Behind her, Wesley was a ghost, a shape of pain, tied to the saddle. She could hear his breathing, a shallow, wet sound that terrified her. They did not stop for the first 2 hours. The sounds of pursuit from Three Forks had grown faint, then disappeared, swallowed by the vast, cold silence of the plains. She knew they had not given up. They were just being smarter, waiting for the dawn. Before first light, she found what she was looking for, a river, wide and black, its edges choked with a ragged crust of ice. "Hold on, Wesley," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. She urged Stone into the water. The big gelding balked, snorting, the ice cracking under his hooves. The water was fast, and it was deep, a frigid, churning blackness that stole her breath. She kicked, and Stone lunged, half swimming, half climbing, breaking a path. She reached the far bank, her legs numb to the hip, and turned. The mare, carrying Wesley, was frozen on the bank, too weak or too frightened to follow. "Come on," Illa yelled, her voice raw. The horse just trembled, cursing. Illa slid from Stone's back into the freezing water again and waded back across. The current tried to take her, but her weight held her. She grabbed the mare's bridle. She pulled, her muscles straining, hauling the horse and its broken rider, step by agonizing step, through the treacherous, ice-choked water. They reached the other side, two half-drowned creatures. Wesley had slumped sideways, his face in the horse's icy mane, unconscious. Illa's hands were so cold she could barely untie him, but she did. She tied the mare's reins to Stone's saddle, and she rode on, pushing them, into the high hills as the sun rose behind them. They were safe from pursuit. No man, not even Flint Croft, would risk that river in the dark for a runaway giant and a half-dead man. But they were not safe from the cold, or from the wounds. For 3 days, they traveled. Wesley's consciousness was a flickering, guttering candle. The wounds from the beating were not clean. A fever had set in, a dry, burning heat that radiated from him. He would tremble, his teeth chattering, and then his skin would be on fire, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. His broken ribs made every breath a new torment. Illa did not sleep. She rode, her body a rigid column of endurance. One hand on her reins, the other held back, resting on Wesley's leg, just to assure herself he was still there. He would, in his delirium, apologize. I'm sorry. "Illa," he'd mutter, his one good eye cloudy, unfocused. "I'm weak. I lost the fight. Should have run." "Hush, Wesley," she'd say, her voice thick. "Just hold on." "A burden," he'd cough, a wet, terrible sound. "Just leave me. You can get away. Just a coward. I'm so sorry." On the 3rd day, the mare, old and pushed too hard, stumbled and fell. She did not get up. Illa slid from Stone, her own legs aching, and went to the horse. It was finished. Its breathing was ragged. Illa pulled her rifle from her saddle. She petted the mare's head, and then, with a single, clean shot, ended her suffering. Wesley had slid from the saddle when the horse fell. He lay in the snow, a broken, tangled heap, his eyes closed, the fever raging. Illa stood for a long moment, the rifle smoking in her hand. The silence of the mountains was absolute. There was only the wind. There was Stone, weary and plated in ice. And there was Wesley, dying in the snow. She could leave him. He was right. She could take Stone and her rifle, and she could disappear into the high country. She could survive. She had always survived. She looked down at his face, so still, so unrecognizable from the beating. She saw the man who had flinched when she touched him, the man who had faced down Brody, the man who had looked at her, his voice shaking. and said, "I'm trying to be him. Illa." She put the rifle back in its scabbard. She knelt beside him. "Listen to me, Wesley," she said, her voice a low, fierce command. She slid her arms under him, one under his back, one under his knees. "You are not a burden." She braced herself, and she lifted him. He was not heavy, not for her, but he was a dead weight. He was 150 pounds of broken bone and fever. She stood, her own body screaming in protest, and she began to walk, carrying him in her arms. She walked for what felt like a day. She walked until her shoulders burned and her legs were water. She walked until the world was just the crunch of her boots in the snow and the hot, shallow breath of the man in her arms. He stirred, his head rolling against her chest. His eyes fluttered open. He was lucid. For just a second, he saw her, saw the strain on her face, the way she was carrying him. "Illa," he whispered, his voice broken. "No, please, you can't. I'm not worth it. I lost." She stopped. She sank to her knees in the snow, but she did not put him down. She held him, his body cradled against her, and she looked down into his one open, pain-filled eye. "You listen to me," she said, her voice a raw rasp, shaking with an emotion she had no name for. "You lost. It don't matter. You think I care about that? You think that's what matters to me?" He just stared, confused. "You gave me something," she said, her voice breaking, the tears freezing on her face. "You gave me something no one ever has. Not my PA, not any man in this whole hard world. You stayed." His eye, his one good eye, filled with a slow, pained understanding. You were beaten, you were broken, and you stayed," she said, the words torn from her. "You fought for me, Wesley. You didn't run. You looked at Brody, and you looked at Flint, and you stayed. I never had that. No one has ever stayed." She leaned her head down, her forehead resting against his, and for a moment, she let herself weep. "So you hold on. You hear me? You hold on. You don't get to die. Not now." She stood up again, her strength renewed, and she kept walking. She found it just before dusk, a small, dark shape against the snow, tucked under a granite overhang. It was an old trapper's cabin, long abandoned. The door was gone. The roof was half caved in, but it was 3 walls and a rock chimney. It was shelter. She carried him inside, laying him on a nest of dry, rotten pine needles in the corner, as far from the wind as possible. She took the blankets from Stone and covered him. She went back out. She hacked down dead, dry branches with her knife, her hands raw. She pulled stones to block the doorway. She used the last of her strength to build a fire, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to strike a spark. The fire caught. Warmth. She melted snow in the small pot from her saddlebag. She sat beside him, the long night settling in, and she tended him. He was going. She could feel it. The fever was a living thing, a demon in his blood, trying to cook him from the inside. He was shaking, a terrible, violent, bone-rattling chill. And then he was still, his skin like fire, his lips cracked and dry. She did not rest. She went out, into the dark, and she packed snow against his body. Trying to break the heat, she dripped water between his lips. She held his hand. She talked. She told him about the mountains. She told him about the first deer she ever shot. She told him about her mother's silver ring. She told him anything, everything, her voice a low, steady rumble in the dark, a lifeline for him to hold on to. "You stay, Wesley," she commanded, her voice raw. "You hear me? You stay. You don't get to leave me here." Sometime, in the deepest part of the night, the shaking stopped. He became very, very still. His breathing, which had been a ragged gasp, smoothed, becoming faint. But even the fire in his skin had banked. She put her hand on his chest. It was cool, damp. The fever had broken. She sagged, her head falling onto his chest, and for the first time in 4 days, she slept. She woke to the feeling of a hand. It was weak, and it was trembling, but it was in her hair. She snapped her head up. Wesley was awake. His eye, the one that could open, was clear. It was him. The swelling was down, his face a landscape of purple and yellow. But it was him. He was looking at her. "Illa," he whispered. His voice was a dry, cracked reed. She couldn't speak. She just stared, her heart a wild, painful thing in her chest. He looked around, at the ruined cabin, at the fire, at her face smudged with soot and tear tracks, her hair a wild mat. He remembered. The river, the cold, her voice, her carrying him, her saying you stayed. A small, slow, pained smile touched his lips. You're a mess," he whispered. She let out a sound, half sob, half laugh. She grabbed his hand. You're one to talk. You look like you lost a fight with a bear." I did," he said, his smile widening. "A she-bear." They were quiet for a moment. He just looked at her, his eye tracing her face, as if seeing it for the first time. "Illa," he said, and his voice, though weak, was sure. It was not the voice of the boy who had run. It was not the voice of the man who had flinched. It was a new voice. I love you. I'm sure of it now. I love you." Illa's breath hitched. She had faced down men and blizzards. She had hauled a deer on her back, but this one, small man, looking at her from the ruins of his face, saying those words, it broke her. She tried to nod. She tried to be strong, but the tears came, hot and fast, and a smile, a real trembling, watery smile, broke across her face. You just stay," she whispered, squeezing his hand. You just stay, Wesley." Spring came, not as a gentle thaw, but as a violent, cracking rebirth. The snow melted, the rivers raged, and the high country, which had been a world of white and gray, exploded into a riot of green. They were safe. The world below, the world of men and towns, was a bad dream. They were too high, too remote. No one would look for them here. They left the trapper's cabin. Wesley was weak, but he could walk. Illa had found Stone, who had survived, grazing in a high meadow. She put Wesley on the horse, and she walked beside him. They found their place. They found it 5 miles higher, in a valley cupped between 3 granite peaks, a place where a waterfall fed a small, clear lake. It was, Illa said, the most beautiful place she had ever seen. And they began to build. It was slow, but it was shared. Her strength was their engine. She felled the trees, she dragged the logs. She was magnificent, a force of nature, her muscles working in the bright spring sun. He, in turn, was their hands. As his strength returned, so did his skill. His ribs mended, his face healed, leaving only a small, pale scar along his jaw. He was not a man of brute force. He was a man of precision. He notched the logs, his cuts clean and perfect. He built their furniture, a solid table, 2 strong chairs. He built the fireplace, stone by stone. His work neat and true. He began to carve again. In the long, warm evenings, he would sit by the door, a piece of soft pine in his hands. He carved the things he saw. A hawk, its wings spread. A small, perfect trout. He was carving a small bird, its head tilted, and he gave it to her. She held it, her large, calloused hand cradling the delicate, smooth wood. She had never been given a gift, a thing of pure, simple beauty. She kept it in her pocket. Illa changed, too. In the abandoned cabin, she had found a moldy, water-damaged logbook. Most of it was ruined, but the last dozen pages were blank. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire, and she began to write. She did not write about her past. She wrote about the present. She wrote about the color of the lake. She wrote about the taste of the first wild onions of spring. She wrote about the sound of Wesley's knife, shh, 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 on the wood. She was, for the first time, telling her own story. One day, she came back from checking her new snares, 2 fat rabbits slung over her shoulder. She found Wesley working on the doorframe of their new, solid cabin. He was whistling, the same tuneless, happy song she had heard just before the riders came. She stopped, 20 yards away. She looked at the door, and her heart, her big, strong, guarded heart, just stopped. The door frame was tall. It was impossibly, magnificently, beautifully tall. It was built for her. She walked forward, slowly, dropping the rabbits by the step. He looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead, his face nervous.
"Wesley,"
she said, her voice thick.
I was just setting it,"
he stammered, gesturing with his hammer. She stood in the frame. She stood tall, at her full height, her boots on the new-cut threshold. Her head did not touch the top. She had a full hand's breadth of clear, open air above her. She did not have to duck. She did not have to stoop. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her, his heart in his eyes. "A home," he said, his voice quiet. "A home ought to fit the people in it. I didn't want you to ever have to duck again, not in your own home." She looked at him, at this small, fine, brave man who had built her a world that fit. She reached out and she took his hand. It was not the small, weak hand he had always despised. It was a carpenter's hand, strong and sure, and it fit perfectly in hers. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the high peaks in colors of fire and rose. She looked out at the valley, at their home. She was taller than any of the new-growth pines, and she was holding his hand. "I used to think I was too much," she whispered, her voice rough with feeling, looking at the mountains. "I used to think my PA was right, that I was built wrong." She turned, and she looked at him, at his good, kind, strong face. "But maybe," she said, a small, sure smile touching her lips, "maybe I was just meant for a man with more heart." He looked up at her, at his giant, at his beautiful, strong Ila, and he smiled. He pulled her, gently, and she stooped, just a little, and they kissed. It was not the desperate, starving kiss of the storm. It was not the fumbling, awkward kiss of discovery. It was not the weeping, relieved kiss of the fever. It was a kiss of knowing. It was slow, and it was deep. There was no fear in it. There was no shame. It was just two people, in the home they had built, who had found, in the wildest, hardest, most unforgiving of places, a home in each other. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear from you. Please, take a moment to comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories just like this one. And finally, share your thoughts in English in the comments below. We read everyone. Thank you again.